So, welcome to the talk Tracking the Tractors. Well, at least it started out with tracking tractors, but we came out somewhere completely differently. So, my name is Felix. I'm here with a colleague, Bernhard. Bernhard is kind of my go-to guy for everything low-level and embedded. And together we do a lot of OT pen testing. So we're pen testing stuff like PLCs, HMIs, and for example, SCADA systems. And quite to the contrary of this picture, we never had to do anything with farming or agriculture in general. However, we have a friend or co-researcher, Sebastian, and one late evening, after 3 rounds of darts and maybe some beers, he told us basically, hey, I have this friend who's selling automation systems for tractors that can basically turn any tractor smart. And we were like, what? You can automate the tractor? And that got us into researching this topic a bit more. Well, it turns out digitalization in farming is a huge topic right now. Every aspect of modern-day farming can be augmented with digitalization nowadays. For example, the most common augmentation you see nowadays is GPS-guided farming, which ranges from just having your GPS information of your field up to full automation of your tractor automatically driving on your field. And I always thought, like, that's all crazy future tech. I will never see anyone use this close to where I live. Well, after we talked to some farmers, turns out they're quite happy to adopt these technologies. And for example, one farmer even used an infrared drone to spot wildlife on his field before plowing the field. So digitalization in this field is increasing. But aside from digitalization, we also have like active research in there because the tech surface of these components is becoming more connected. And most of the automotive research that's been done in this field is also like classic automotive research, like attacks on CAN bus or on ECUs. But there's also some more dedicated and specific research, like the talk from Sickholz on DEF CON 30, where he showed that he was able to jailbreak a John Deere tractor and play Doom on it, which is the perfect POC. And if you're interested in this talk, also check out his talk. And aside from active research, there's also active attacks. Like, for example, a farmer in Switzerland got ransomware, but the system that was ransomware was not his normal PC, it was his milking robot. And the system was also tasked with taking the vital values of the cows. So suddenly, nobody had any vital data of the cows anymore, and nobody noticed that the cow got sick, which indirectly led to a death of a cow. And that's probably one of the most unexpected impacts of a ransomware attack. Okay, so how does this automation work? So you see here, this is like a typical automation system. And on the right side of the screen, you see like this is like a steering system. That's a post-market solution that can help you to automate the tractor. On the right side, you see this is a demonstration setup because we couldn't fit the whole tractor in our lab. And the whole setup consists of a steering wheel, a tablet or an HMI, and a GPS antenna. And it's not that expensive. It costs like $5,000 to $10,000, which is rather cheap compared to a new tractor, which often starts with $250,000. So you can see why farmers like to use these systems. And to give you a better understanding how the system is integrated, it's rather straightforward. So you put on a tablet, replace the steering wheel, put on some sensors, and then you're good to go. So then you have made your tractor smart. And it works for all kinds of farming machinery, basically. You also can integrate stuff like the plow or other additional hardware on the tractor. And the only thing then left to do is like you still need to like define your field, decide what kind of pattern you want to drive in the field, and next time you go to your field with the tractor, you can just hit play, and it automatically plows your field, for example. And that's quite powerful automation. So, and before we started really researching these topics and these different devices, we did some little market research to see which systems are more common. And because we live in Central Europe, we looked at the systems that are being sold in Central Europe, and there are 2 dominant brands. The one is FG Dynamics, and the other is Swywerko. And if you look a bit more to the east, you see in Russia, for example, you see Novopmo, which is a different vendor but has a similar system. There are some other vendors, but these are like the systems that's being sold the most. And we got our hands on a FGD and Swywerko system, and turns out they are the same system. Because like FGD is like building the systems, and Swywerko, for example, is just a rebrand of the same system. And that was actually great news for us, because we knew now we would not, our users does not only affect like 1 or 2 devices, it affects like a huge part of the automation market for the systems, because like these are the two dominant brands. And Bernhard will walk you through some of the vulnerabilities.
Thank you, Felix. Hello also from my side. Let's begin with a rough overview of our 82 system. We have three components here. We have our 82 HMI tablet, which is basically the interface of the farmer from the cockpit. We have our motor on our steering wheel, and we have our GPS antenna on top of the tractor, which gets the GPS coordinates from the satellite and communicates it then via HTTPS and MQTT to the cloud, Azure Dynamic Clouds, which is situated in China. You also have a Bluetooth remote controller, which you can use to remotely control your 82 tablet. MQTT is a lightweight messaging protocol, which is commonly used in IoT products, where you can use for exchanging messages between different MQTT clients via a central broker. So our immediate focus was to monitor the outgoing traffic, where we have the TLS encrypted MQTT broker connection here. And what we have here is a TLS encrypted communication, where what we have here is an encrypted traffic. And
no problem. Like, you see here this like TLS encrypted traffic, and we had the issue like we wanted to see this traffic, what's going on there, but this device was a rental device, and we were like, well, we cannot like modify it, so we have to give it back. And we had the problem we need to decrypt this traffic. And so we did our common thing, like we redirected the traffic and verified if there would be some form of TLS validation issue, because that would be the easiest thing without having to modify the system itself. And well, it turns out TLS validation isn't a thing, and they just do not validate any kind of TLS certificates in the system, which was great news for us, because then we had access to the credentials of the client device to the broker. And here's the example. We just opened a raw netcard socket and redirected MQTT traffic in there. So this is like a raw hex dump of the MQTT packet. So you see here in the green field, this is a client ID. This is like a user agent in HTTP, like arbitrary text field. And in the bottom, you see like, in the blue field, you see like the product name and the password. We blank the password. But like the really odd thing here is like the product didn't, or the device didn't use its serial number, it used the product ID, like 82. So it is all devices use the same username and the same password, which is already a bit sketchy. But we will come to this later on. Well, and then we thought, okay, we use just MQTT Explorer, a common client, to use this protocol, and put in the password, put in the username, and we're good to go. Well, turns out it didn't work, because they are using a client TLS certificate as well. And that's one of the weirdest TLS combinations I've ever seen. Because on the one hand, they have like no TLS validation, but they use a client TLS certificate with a username and a password. Well, so our next task was basically, we needed to extract that certificate for our authentication. And yeah, we had two options. Either we reverse engineer the whole application, or at least the part that handles the certificate authentication, but it was obfuscated, or use Frida instead. Frida is a really cool tool for all kinds of dynamic binary instrumentation. So we use that to write us a custom script to dump all kinds of TLS secrets from the application. And with that, we got our TLS client certificate. So now we were able to access the broker. So we were now able to access the cloud infrastructure and see what kind of messages are being sent to the broker. And you see here, for example, in the screenshot, especially in this red area, you see, for example, the system sends its GPS coordinates to the broker and to notify, hey, I have moved, and then updates the map of the system. And on this broker, all kinds of different topics, like, for example, we have topics for updates of position, for example, if the vehicle parameter changes, for example, if the farmer puts on a different system or different hardware on the tractor, and also the function invoke function, which is kind of interesting because this has exposed a lot of different functions. But the thing is now, we did this research over a year, and within this year, the infrastructure changed. So initially, it was way weaker because the initial was just the username and a static password for all of the devices. The password was just two chars, two characters, and the number 2020 for a password for all of the products. Well, they changed that to a self-registration service. So all devices now register at the broker with a custom password and a custom username. However, that was good news for us because it was like, initially we only had access to like the European broker because we had only a European device. But with that, we could suddenly register on all kinds of brokers they had in different regions. So we were now able to access like data in the US, data in China, and data, for example, in Russia. Okay, but then we thought like, what can we do now? So we tested different test cases. Like we tested what happens if we use like an track that doesn't exist. The system just accepts it. You can log in with a password and a username and a serial number which doesn't exist at all. So it only depends on the password you give yourself, and then you can just say, hey, I'm this device, and it says you're fine. Also, we can also try to impersonate different tractors. Like for example, we knew from our friend that there are different serial numbers for different tractors. We had some of these, we tried them, and the broker also said, okay, you can log in and just impersonate another tractor. But then I thought, damn, if you can impersonate one tractor, why not impersonate all of them? Well, turns out 2 characters did the trick. This is a MQTT multi-level wildcard, which basically just tells, hey, broker, I want to have all the topics and all the messages now. And the broker was like, okay. And so we suddenly had like a lot of data there and like access to thousands of devices that were connected to this broker. And for example, in the red area, see, for example, there are 600 tractors connected with 18,000 messages, and this was just if you open it for 50 seconds. So it's a lot of data. And it was so much data that we had real issues with that, because suddenly our system started crashing because it ran out of memory, because we got so much MQTT traffic in there. So we had to build a custom tool for this. So we call it the Traktor Kraken, which basically, yeah, the name says itself. It just takes all that MQTT data and just ingests it. And we had to like handle like 100K messages per second. So it was quite some engineering that we had to do to get this to work. And here's a little architecture. So we have like all these tractors. They're connected to their local cloud broker. And then we use our Traktor Kraken to connect to this broker and just get all the data. And because like they had this self-registration service, we now had access to all of these brokers now. Well, and since we had access to the data, we could do the scenario analysis now. So over the time of a few months, we saw like 40 cases, 40,000 systems around about, and most of the systems operate in Asia because like it's a Chinese vendor, so well, that's the product where it's being sold the most. But in second place, we have the European Union, where they have like 50,000 of these systems. And in the US, there are just 300 of the systems being sold so far. And the data we see is like, we see all kinds of different GPS data. So we know what the farmer is doing at each of his daily operations. We know where he lives, which fields he tends to, what IP addresses he uses, and also sometimes what email addresses they use, if they, for example, share a field with each other. So there's all kinds of privacy data in there. But we also have like visualized a bit of the data, and see here in the US, you see, for example, they're driving everywhere in the United States, and also in different states. And on the left, you see like an example where it's zoomed in a bit, where you see, for example, they're using the system also on public roads. So it's not like they're driving actively with the system, but they're just not properly turning it off. So it is also used on public roads as well. And the vendor clearly states you have to turn this off if you drive on a public road. But based on the GPS data, we know that farmers are not doing this. So they do not drive actively with this, but just do not properly power it off. Okay, but then we started looking at where else do we see tractors. And we saw tractors in some crazy places. For example, one of them was 20 kilometers away from the front line in Ukraine, and about 3 in the morning. So you also see like this has all kinds of implications that we saw now suddenly can track tractors all around the world. We also saw a tractor that was like close to North Korea, for example, that drove in South Korea. And yeah, so we had a lot of fun at looking at tractors and what they're doing. And we also, for example, saw some interesting patterns because we saw like when tractors are driving closer to Ukraine, we suddenly saw them glitching out sometimes. And we think this was GPS jamming because suddenly they were all over the place. Okay, but this was just what we could do with passive reading the data. But what if we just send some data to the tractors? And the thing is, like, the command set you can send to this tractor is quite limited. So you have like only some commands you can send to them, but these are the commands lock and send notification. So the lock command basically locks the device, and you can no longer operate it. So the tractor is no longer the tractor is operating normally, but the automation is completely gone. And you can spam them with notifications. So you can really annoy them and send them, for example, some messages. And the problem is, like, the broker has no proper authorization. So every tractor can send a notification to every other tractor. And we have a short demo video for this, where you see that the system is just in normal operation, and the driver is just running in a demo model, so it's operating on a normal field. And suddenly you see a pop-up message, the tractor will be locked now, you can specify whatever you want, and it's gone. And that will be possible for all the tractors that are connected to the system. So suddenly all of the systems would be down. And like only the vendor can restore the system. So then every farmer has to call the vendor to unlock this. But the attacker could also spam this command again, and then you're locked again. So the broker has some really wild vulnerabilities. But we also thought, like, these systems are always used on public roads. What if we can hack the steering wheel? What if we can take over the steering wheel and, like, for example, drive the tractor in a ditch? For example, do a hard right turn at some point, and suddenly it goes off the road. So we started researching a bit more how the steering system itself works. And the steering system consists out of a HMI, a steering wheel, and some GPS sensors. And the HMI itself is just an Android tablet. However, the vendor did lock it down a bit, so it's not just you're not just able to launch any app, but it's only launches the default app of the vendor. But it didn't implement this lockdown properly, so like you were able to get your system settings, enable ADB access, and then you had like at least some shell access. And in normal Android, you now would need to line some exploits to get full root access. But, well, this was not a normal Android, because turns out the device was already rooted. And because it took us like basically 5 minutes to root the device, so we had it on the table, started it, did a QS escape, connected USB-C, then we had root access. Because the vendor needed root access for his own code. And we looked at the code and we was wondering, why do they use the root access anyway? Well, turns out they were kind of lazy when it comes to security features, because they did not implement a proper authorization mechanism for accessing other devices within Android. So they had like subsystems in there that were just raw serial devices in Android. And to access them, you would have needed a decent permission system in place to do a proper authorization. But they just dropped a SU binary and then executed their own code. Well, but this was good news for us, so we had root access at the Android system. But we wanted to do this also remotely. And that's where we kept hitting a lot of dead ends. So we tried a lot of things. We tried, for example, to send malicious messages via the broker to get some form of code execution. However, the command set you can send from the broker is quite limited. And it also lands only in safe Java code, which was not vulnerable for any kinds of memory corruption or other issues. We also tried via the network. For example, does it have any services exposed? No, it does not. It has no services exposed. So that left us with the following 3 attack vectors. So with physical access, we can just root it, but that's not so a great attack vector, because then we would need physical access to the device. The next thing is RC via Bluetooth. The system itself is so outdated that it's vulnerable to some well-known Android Bluetooth vulnerabilities. And there are public exploits for this. However, it's like you have to be Bluetooth adjacent for this. Bluetooth has to be enabled. And the exploit crashes the system more often than it gives you a shell. So not the best way. And then we started looking into something that we can man in the middle and just replace the response from the server to the client that could trigger code execution on the HMI itself. And that's where we struck gold. Because what better feature is than the over-the-air update feature? And for some reason, the vendor really dropped the ball on this one. Because like they didn't have like transport encryption for this, and they did not have like any form of validation or signature for this. Normally, when you have some form of firmware update or over-the-air update, you have some form of strong asymmetric signature that protects you from tampering with the image. And in this case, they just used the MD5 sum. So, well, I guess we can calculate that. And on the right side of the screen, you see like this is a typical request. Here it says, hey, it's time to update. We are updating to version 25, and this is the URL you need to download. And that's like a textbook example for drive-by download. So if you're man in the middle, you can just replace this with any kind of binary you want. And because the device is already pre-rooted, this leads to full root code execution. Well, but man in the middle is always hard to get. You have to be network adjacent. It doesn't scale well. That's true. And it doesn't scale well for us, but it's well documented that, for example, nation-state actors or advanced threat groups are capable of performing man-in-the-middle attacks on internet connections. So while we cannot exploit this vulnerability at scale, they probably could. OK, so the attack itself is quite simple. You become man-in-the-middle. You replace the response. For example, in this case, you just replace it with a custom URL. And you have to calculate MD5 sum. Replace the code with 0 at the bottom. That's important, or the client doesn't take the firmware update. And also, you have the possibility to add a custom message, like say, totally not a virus, trust me, I'm a dolphin. OK, so if you do this, then the user is greeted by this delightful dialog. And if the farmer says, oh, that seems legit, and accepts it, we get full root access. I mean, this is like a funny example, but a real attacker could use something more malicious or something that goes more like in social engineering to get the farmer to install the system or the update. And as a POC, for example, we use the metaplater just as a simple POC. And you see here that the APK is being downloaded from the web server, and then the metaplater session is started. So it's quite easy to root this device also remotely. And because it's already rooted, we have already root access. So at this point, we had like full root access via the network. But the thing is, it was still a long way to go to the steering system, because the steering system itself consists out of multiple components. You have like this Android tablet, and then you have like an ECU, which is an embedded device which takes multiple inputs from, for example, the Android tablet and the IMU. The IMU is like an orientation sensor to know how level the tractor is. And the ECU combines its inputs and then makes a steering decision, which it then sends to the motor control unit, the MCU. And then the MCU is the real device that turns the steering wheel. Yeah, so our next task was to tag the ECU. However, this was a rental device. So normally we would like open it up, just attach JTAG to it, or get some form of flash dump to do some form of analysis on it. But this was not an option for us. So we had our only option was either to directly flash the firmware via the Android tablet, or reverse engineer the protocol that's being used for steering. And so we played it safe. And we reverse engineered the protocol. Yeah, but that took us some time, because like the firmware was just 200 kilobytes of raw ARM assembly, no symbols, no strings, no anything. We didn't know the exact specification of the processor, and we did not know what kind of operating system was used in there. So our strategy basically was to look for some function that has a high density of condition statements and a high density of magic bytes, because that's typically how a packet handler looks like. And at some point, we found a function that basically specified how the protocol looks like. And we reverse engineered the sub-function, clean up the code, and we came up with the following protocol spec. So here you see what kind of commands are possible with the steering system. At least we think these are the correct commands, but on the right side, you see the different packets, or the packet structure, and you see the packet always starts with EC91, has some headers, and the most important byte is like the byte 16. So because the byte 16 is the command byte, it basically tells the steering system what kind of command you're sending. And for example, this is a waypoint configuration command, which basically specifies that you're driving from point A to point B. So after the command byte, you have like the command payload, which is in this case 4 float values for 2 times latitude and longitude. And the important thing is like, it's not just enough to send a command like turn left or right, because that's not possible. You have to specify like a certain route to say, hey, we're driving from point A to point B to point C, and then the ECU decides how to reach that point. So the Android system itself has no direct control over the steering wheel. So if you would, for example, want to create a POC where we hijack the steering wheel and just do a left or right turn, we have like to calculate a 90-degree angle to our current position to make, for example, a hard right turn. Okay, so with the protocol specification now, we were close to taking over the steering wheel because we still needed one thing, and that was the correct communication flow. Because it turns out you need multiple packets to turn the steering wheel, because you need a heartbeat to the ECU, because if you stop the heartbeat, the ECU shuts down. You need to specify a waypoint, for example, a configuration that tells the steering system to drive to point A to point B, specify some configuration parameters, and then send the execution command. But then you're good to go. After you send these types of commands, the steering wheel starts turning. If you want a full POC as attacker, you still need to be aware that you have to stop the original app or it will interfere with the steering. Okay, and we put all this together in this demonstration. And here, for example, the system is just in normal operation. It's in passive mode. Like, for example, some people use it on public roads. It's just, you can just normally use the tractor. But it is already pre-routed by the attacker, and he just can flip the switch, and then the steering is gone. Then you have full control of the steering wheel. And the problem is, like, the steering motor is quite strong, so you have now two options. Either you start fighting with the steering wheel over control, or you're quick enough to turn the system off. But this basically takes a split second to drive the tractor in a ditch or lead to a tilt over. So good luck with that. Okay, but in the beginning, I told you, like, we ended up somewhere completely differently, and it turns out that the vendor also has a lot of other devices connected to the broker. And at some point, we saw like a function call that's called take photo, and we're like, what's going on here? Who's taking a picture, and why is they taking a tractor a picture? Well, it turns out it wasn't a tractor, it was a lawnmower that the same vendor is building, but it's connected to the same broken cloud infrastructure. And how this lawnmower operates, they basically just take a picture of the camera, upload it to a cloud bucket, and then you send the cloud bucket URL via the broker. And because we were listening on a broker, we saw like the URLs to this cloud bucket pictures. And normally when you have cloud buckets, there would be some form of signature, some form of token that protects you from just, so that you cannot just download the pictures from there. Well, the vendor forgot also about this. So suddenly we had like full access to camera feeds around the world from multiple lawnmowers across different continents. And like we have a whole selection of video feeds from different lawnmowers suddenly. Well, talk about scope creep. Okay, here's a short demo for this. And here you see, for example, different lawnmowers. In the left you see like a soccer field and some stadium. And this is just a short snippet, but we had like access to a lot of different of these video feeds suddenly. Yeah, it was also quite interesting to watch what all these tractors, what those lawnmowers are doing. Okay, but that was not the craziest part. We also saw something different. We saw like, at some point, we saw like a device called open door, call elevator, close door, and open door again. We're like, what's going on here? Well, turns out the vendor is also building some different platforms as well. They're like also building automation robots that are able to like take the elevator and drive, for example, from point A to point B and also open doors. You might have seen this, for example, in bars or in hotels where suddenly you can call an elevator, call a robot, and it will drive up to your floor and serve you some drinks, for example. And the thing is, like, we were on a broker and we were able to do the same calls. And we were interested, maybe we could try these calls, but we didn't do this because we didn't own the hardware, so we didn't want to interfere with some of the operations. But we were quite confident that we would be able to just replay these calls and call an elevator and call an open door somewhere else. And this is also, for example, how the vendor sells the system. So it has like the integration between, for example, an elevator and a robot, and you can just use this to open doors and call an elevator. And that will be probably one of the most unexpected red teaming strategies ever. If you, for example, hacked like this robot and suddenly you get access to a door or to an elevator. Okay, so what does the vendor say about this? Well, we have been talking to the vendor for over a year now. We reported this last year in June. And the communication was a bit tricky. At some point, the vendor took a little break, and in May, they came back and said, yeah, everything is fixed, but we don't know what they fixed. They didn't fix the security issues. And 2 weeks before Black Hat, suddenly the CEO noticed that there's something going on, and we got in touch with the CEO of the company, and turns out there was some internal miscommunication, and the security issues have not been properly communicated within the organization, and they are currently still mitigating these issues. Okay, so let's close out with the lessons learned. Okay, so digitalization in agriculture is a huge topic, and you see a lot of new technology being fielded there, and there's a lot of research potential there to be tested and to be hacked. Also, from our personal experience, security awareness in this field is not that high. So especially when it comes to users and sometimes the vendors, they do not care about cybersecurity or the issues they introduce with introducing these technologies. And also, agriculture is at large scale also critical infrastructure. So this technology should live up to a higher standard. Okay, so that was it for the talk. I would like to kick off the Q&A session, and I would like to answer the most important question first. Does it run Doom? Yes, it does. First. The question was, is the vendor here? We don't know. I don't think so. Also, we don't know. They have some mitigations in place, but we haven't had the time to test them because we're like 2 weeks before Black Hat. So, yeah, we had some email correspondence. They said, hey, they fixed it, but we don't know. But the thing is, like, it's not just they have to fix it. They also have to like upgrade all the farmers for this, and yeah, they have to This probably will take them some time to upgrade all these devices.
Did I get it right that the steering wheel had also Bluetooth controller? And did you look into communication between this Bluetooth controller and the steering wheel?
Yeah, we tried that. Also, we took a look at this but this is just a standard Android Bluetooth interface. So some farmers use this. There's a remote steering controller for this, like a remote. And it just connects to the Android and just inputs some normal inputs like a keyboard, for example. So it's just standard Android Bluetooth stack.
Okay, so it just acted as a hit keyboard, right?
Yeah, okay. It acts as similar to a keyboard. Yes, please. The question was if we could refine the steering wheel control. In theory, we would have been able, but for the POC, we just used to a point. So we basically can specify a point to drive from A to B, and then we will have to calculate what kind of route we want to drive. So we're quite close to doing a full control over the steering wheel, but we never implemented this. Yes, please.
What functionality does the MQTT broker provide the system? Can you go without it? I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's also some other platforms that are integrated with this data. They have a fleet management software where you can track the data, but it's also for tracking what kind of operations you did on a field. You can drive the tractor offline as well if you have the maps offline. So it's not mandatory to use this every time, but it's used by most of these farmers to have the data on your fields, off your fields.
Can the farmers turn off access to the MQTT broker?
Yeah, they can partially. So they have to synchronize the maps, but if they did this, then they can use this in offline mode. Okay, I think that's it. Then I say thank you and see you.